Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Welcome to this video. Thank you for continuing to support the channel, and if you haven't done so, please consider hitting the subscribe button and share this video with your family and friends for whom this may be relevant in your opinion, in your or divine opinion, right? Okay, in this conversation I will dive into a few things, and this may be a longer video, we'll see how it goes. But first I would like to outline sort of the basis, again, of the relationship between the ego and the unconscious, and then I'll leap into alchemy and the problem of individuation as it's represented in alchemy. And the goal, and that's where we're going to what we're going to move to, is a brief sort of prelude or interlude into the issue of God and the issue of the necessity for God to be distant. So sort of this Deus absconditus that Jung proposes, with sort of the idea that this opens a space in which we can criticize modern or contemporary developments of sort of God ideas or God images, especially also let's say modern spirituality, this idea of oneness in sort of, let's say, psychedelic experiences, or let's say the replacement of God by with, let's say something like moral ideas, or even worse, consumerism, capitalism, God in this sense metaphorically viewed as an ideal or something to strive towards, something to attempt to integrate. So we'll move towards that criticism, which I don't think we'll get to in this video because that would just be too much to cover, but we'll get to that in subsequent videos. But this will sort of be the groundwork for that, and I think this video is also a really good introduction, concise introduction to individuation, that's not so much concerned with, oh, here are some pictures that we're looking at in mandalas, but it's more concerned with the problematic of the theoretical problematic of individuation, how it plays out in alchemy in specific. So let's delve right into it. So the starting point, as always, is the ego, that we have talked about extensively in other videos, where we have seen that the ego is essentially it's nothing, it's empty. It's sort of a reflex that builds a linear narrative. And here's something interesting that I've been told yesterday by a good friend, and he said, oh, he rewatched the TV show True Detective. Some of you may have watched it. It's quite interesting to watch, and I watched it in undergrad, and with good friends, and we did sort of a public viewing of it, and it was very interesting. But I never really noticed that there's this, I noticed they say time is a flat circle, but I never really noticed they went into more detail on that theory. And so this friend yesterday, he told me that what this essentially implies is the idea that you move through sort of rooms that represent moments in time, and the only thing substantial, or the only thing existent, is the ego that moves through that and sort of explores those moments in a different sort of in their different expressions, and that's sort of a perpetual process. And I don't want to go into this idea now. I think we should discuss this idea probably. We should discuss this idea probably in a separate video. I just noted this down. But what I do want to say is that the ego has this function of being the continuity, right? It builds and constructs the continuity that we as, like, what is we, right? We could ask that question, like, what am I? It's a very fundamental question, and I don't want to answer it here. I don't want to, I don't want to get into that discussion. But one of the answers is we are the continuity that we experience ourselves as. Like, I am the same today as that I was yesterday, and that I will be tomorrow, and so on. And that this continuity is very fundamental to the ability to interact with the world as it represents itself as external elements, let's say external agents, external actors, external objects, and so on. So I know I can manipulate this coffee cup today, and I know I'll be able to manipulate it tomorrow in the same or similar way, and talk and so on, and sleep. And so there's a certain continuity, and the early precursors of this continuity, like when consciousness and the ego was in the process of development, um, were cosmical. I hope that's a word. Cosmical. So elements of the cosmos. So let's say the sun rising, the moon rising, the stars, and so on and so forth. And so we have this. This is probably another brief note I should take. Sorry, but it's always good to note down. I think when there's an idea coming up, and I want to delve into it in more depth for you, and I'd be curious to understand also if that's something you're interested in discussing, and or what else is interesting for you. But the earliest precursors here are elements of stability, right? You have this moment, and this is of course a large part of the Jungian argument that's also laid out in Erich Neumann's book, History and Origins of Consciousness. That you have a development of consciousness that's not only sort of in a lifespan, from newborn to adult, but this development is also reflected in sort of the phylogenetic, if you will, history of humankind, right? Where you have at the level of the animal, you have this sort of a drive-driven, instinct-driven, drive-driven behavioral pattern that's just sort of it's sort of constantly caught in this mystical participation, so participation mystique, that Jung, although you couldn't call it that because it doesn't have anything to go up against, right? For participation mystique, you need something to experience that participation, or to at least reflect on it if you can't experience it in the moment. And what you have is this instinct-driven sort of, the bee, or the bear building the cave, and you couldn't have a bear not building a cave. It just doesn't work unless there's something wrong with the bear. You see every bear building a cave always, and so on. And that's why, and with the continuing differentiation of consciousness, you see these you hold on, you latch on to these elements of stability. So you see very early images, for example, you have these line crosses and cave art that make sense, and you start with a horizontal line, with in a vertical line with this, with the cosmical bodies rising and falling. They move, so it's up and down movement. It's an up and down and a horizontal movement because you have the horizon along which stuff moves, and so it's the first attempt to establish order, and order in this sense. I mean, it's not sort of some abstract, weird term that Jordan Peterson invents, but it's more like, or not invents, but uses. But what it is essentially just the continuity between today and tomorrow. It's sort of the discovery of time, in a sense that, and Peterson relates this then to sacrifice, the performance of sacrificial rites. But I think it's way earlier than that. It's very fundamental to the ability to build or construct consciousness. And so this is essentially the function of or we can witness in that the rise of the ego, right? And what the ego now does essentially in the process of differentiating from its containment in the unconscious, because that's essentially the starting point, right? As we see here also in this figure somewhere, in the editorial process, I'll put it somewhere. We see that the self is essentially in its original state. It's contained in the uterus. It's contained in the self, right? That a lot of times we talked about this and said, look, for the baby, essentially the self, and it's not me. It's not my body. It's not sort of my thoughts. That's not the self. Has nothing to do with it, right? That's all ego thinking, right? If we think, oh yeah, the self, that's going to be some kind of unique relationship to me, and kind of, no, it's not. It's for in that stage, right? What that means is essentially, and oh, this pertains, by the way, also to this. Babies are so wise. It's like, really? Have you interacted with a baby? It's like, but theoretically, on a theoretical level, it's this moment where everything is you. right? You are everything and everything is you. So there's an interesting way of framing it to say, like, if you don't differentiate consciousness, you never have a relationship to anything but you, right? Because everything in the world is you, the tree is you, the sun is you, and so with a little bit of continuing differentiation, you'll see some in the original stages, you will behave like everything is you and you're part of everything, right? And this is, by the way, also why in these these ecological movements where we have to see ourselves as part of the ecosystem of the world. We're part of the whole. We are the whole. We are the world, which is all great. I think those are great things to teach. But what we see there, especially children, but what we see there lurking in the back of it is this desire, a desire I think that's very present in Jung. It's like this desire for return, this desire for the return to the stage of wholeness, the stage of unity. Okay, so, but essentially, and then at some point you see that that we are part of the whole, we're part of one, and then at some point you see that we suddenly start worshiping at sunrise because we think the sun won't rise without us, and that's already a step further, right? That's an action you take in order for the sun to rise, kind of thing. So that's already, you see a bit of a split between object and subject here already, right? An object being, in this sense, the objective, the self, if you will, the objective kernel of the personality, while subject is sort of the ego, the subjective kernel of personality. And so that's the stage. That's the stage we start with, right? And then you have a continuing differentiation of the ego from this oneness with everything. And what that means is for Jung, that's the first part, the first part of individuation. There are essentially two stages of individuation, and the first stage is the task of the first half of life, and it involves the natural development of the personality and social adaptation. So it's sort of this persona that you develop towards society, which can be pathological or not, or whatever. It's about developing a work path. Essentially, it's about finding one's place in society, whereas that place is not necessarily particularly reflected, right? It's simply like, I am surviving, if you will. Like, I am here, I know I can work as this person, and I can make money, and I can do this and that and this. It doesn't have anything to do with purpose necessarily in the way that we think about it when we consider the second part of individuation, or the second stage of individuation, which involves, the integration of the shadow, the regulation of energies, and so on. Like, basically, the first stage of life is kind of, it's kind of like a manic. It involves sort of being manic, being depressed. Like, I don't want to say it's a manic depressive phase, but in the sense that what occurs is that you're still super susceptible in this first half, especially at the beginning, to the engulfment with energies from the archetypal field and from the complexes on the other side. And so this is where we have to understand now the ego at a deeper level, right? So the ego in its like, when I say the ego, what I mean, and I believe Jung means the same to some extent, but what I mean is the central determinant of consciousness, so the central narrative function of consciousness. So basically, ego is that to which all other complexes within the network that's built around the ego relate. Because, or actually, I think the other way around, the ego relates to all of these all of these elements in the network by way of interpretation, right? So the ego essentially is nothing but an interpretive, linearity building function. There's nothing to it that is essence, except that it interprets other elements that then form its essence. So, and these elements is what Jung refers to as the complexes of the psyche, so the psychic complexes, which are, you can imagine them as nodes. I imagine them in spatial metaphor. You have, if you know neural networks, you have something, these little blobs, and they're sort of connected by lines. Maybe I'll put a picture somewhere in the editorial. It's always very dull to talk, and then you have to edit things into it, and you're like, here, but then it's here, and so, but yeah, you see they're like nodes, right? Here's one, my head is another one, my head is maybe the central, we can imagine it like that, you can imagine it like organs. Your head is the central organ, and you have all these other organs in your body, right? Where the head goes and unifies all these organs into the vision of an integrated body that functions the same way tomorrow as it does today. And so that's the ego, right? It's just this the brain itself has no, there's no point to it. It's simply a piece of mass. It only starts making sense with all these interconnected relations to the different nodes within the body that it can steer and use to form a linearity. And so that's essentially what the ego at its core does. Now you have these other complexes, the organs in this metaphor, the nodes in the other metaphor, that all have an individual sort of, let's say, theme. You know, they all have a theme, right? It's not like you have 1,000 different complexes or nodes that describe your relationship to a garden, let's say. But these themes organize the experience you have in the world in terms of integrating them into this entire into this sort of this node, or into this complex, as we then call it. And these themes, you know, the trajectories that, if you will, that allow you to build a coherent, in quotation marks, an interpretable set of psychic experiences as a human, those themes are what Jung would call then the archetypes, right? So they are the core, the bone, if you will, around which the flesh is built. They are the bone at the core of the complexes around which the flesh being the experiences you personally have, can be built. And this already tells you a lot about the archetypes, right? Because the archetypes are not, as many think, images, primordial images that you inherit or something, but they're essentially the architecture, the scaffolding, if you will. I hope that's right. I'm not sure. The corpus, if you will, the bones again, of the entire structure that then forms your psyche. So you have this. That's what you inherit. You inherit essentially the tendencies around which content will be built. That is an evolutionary sort of process, and I think this is really key to understand that this is something that can be transformed, and we'll talk about this in other videos in much more detail, because I think it's super crucial to understand that the archetypes are not something that's fixed, you know, right? It's fixed today from your perspective, yes, but that's because it hasn't been fixed all along. And it's so interesting, I think, in Jung to see that something very fundamental about the world, not only the spiritual but also the physical world, is actually a measurement size or a variable that is transmutable. It's shapeable. I'm going to close my door for a minute. Come on. Sorry. And so what you see is this like a crystal that grows in a glass, right? That's the Jungian metaphor. You have this moment where you have something that structures your psyche sort of preeminently, and that is the archetype, or that are the archetypes. And Jung says there are as many archetypes as there are situations in life, but some are more central or more forming than others, and more, especially more central, fundamental to the psychic experience as humans, and unique experience as humans, or as mammals, if you will. You know, the relationship to your mother and your father, the relationship to the chaotic and the unknown, you know, the relationship to, or darkness for that matter, whatever you want to call it, the new, the novel, right? The relationship to maybe sleep, the relationship to a let's say paternal-like figure like God, a deity, something that leads you, the wise old man in Jung, the relationship to something you love, or someone you love better, you know, the anima animus, and so on. So those are the fundamental relationships that you have. The relationship to yourself and sort of the leading deity in your life, the self, and so on. So here, the relationship to something that nourishes you, you know, like water, the well, again, the feminine. So those are sort of the more fundamental archetypes. But then, as Jung says, there are as many of these trajectories as there are moments and encounterings with in the human history. And so now we know that the flesh, right, the experiences you have are built on top of these bones, these cores, these archetypal cores. So Jung actually explains to us that what occurs with these archetypal cores is they deliver the energy that we need for a psychic existence. So they propel us forward, similar to the drives, right? Like Jung always compares the archetypes to the instincts or the drives, where it's essentially, the idea is essentially they drive us forward, as it were, and allow us to act or to release energy in the context of certain encounters with certain situations. And so here the idea becomes that you build flesh on top of these bones, and this flesh may dilute your view onto these archetypes, right? Onto these bones, and they may dilute then also the meaning of them or the energy that flows from them, right? And this is problematic because the energy then may get blocked. And so here comes the role of the ego. Okay, so the ego essentially, and this is what you do in the first half of your life, the role of the ego is to establish a way of dealing with society and societal sort of navigation. It's a narrative. That's why I've been using the term narrative as well. It's a story you tell others about yourself, although that would sort of be the persona as a sub aspect of the ego. But it's a story you tell yourself and others about yourself. And with that, it's a way of interpreting the flesh that is built around the archetypes, let alone the archetypes. Like, you don't know about them. Like, you have no idea they exist. Like, you're so detached from them that in the first half of your life, you don't have a clue what the hell an archetype. Like, you don't know that there's anything collective to you. You think you're you, and that's it, right? If you're in, let's say, post-puberty or in adolescent times, and you're that's all that you struggle with is trying to be different from your mom and dad, and you try to be different from others in society, and you somehow try to build a life for your own, and you try to and you have all these, this is where ego psychology comes in, or Freudian or Lacanian psychology, where it's like what you attempt to do is basically establish a relationship to yourself and and reconcile the traumas you had, and establish a relationship to, let's say, the big other, like society and the norms and so on, and try to somehow deal with desire. So the moment, desire in the Lacanian sense, so the moment in which the drive is sort of barred or prohibited. So you try to deal with that and its pathological expression. So that's ego psychology. Jung would say that's the first part of, like, the first half of life, the first stage of individuation, if you will. And there are stark differences still here between Freudian, Lacanian approaches and Jungian approaches to especially practical analysis, but I'm not an expert on that. But so we know that if the energies from the archetypes at the core of these complexes get blocked, you have pathological, in the worst cases, pathological experiences. And sort of the idea of the second stage of individuation, so this is the individuation that we all sort of know about and heard about, it's this reconnection with the self, is to release those energies. So it's essentially the idea, if the ego narrates over, let's say, by way of its interpretation, narrates away these central archetypal sort of moments or cores, right? And even, I would say, the complexes that are on top, so the element, the content on top of them, then the goal, the idea of the second stage of life is to sort of the second stage of individuation is to get in touch with the content on top of it, and that's what I refer to as sort of debt. You owe you owe the content on top of it to other people, right? And if you want to learn more about death, then check out another video. It's not a Jungian idea. It's something that I interpreted into Jung. And then to get to the core, you have this you need to attempt to get in touch with those archetypal contexts, right? And so here is where alchemy comes in, where individuation, as we think about it, comes in, right? So what happens in what has to happen to the central ego narrative, as well as the complexes that sort of bar or hide the ego's the archetypes, the bones that are at their center. So what has to happen here? It's pretty obvious, I think, if you're familiar with any mythological or alchemical or Jungian theme that what has to happen is a sort of gesture of sacrifice, right? But in order for sacrifice to happen, you really have to think, like, you have to think about preparatory action. So something has to occur in order to drive the ego to its to sacrifice essentially itself, right? And this is really interesting because, as we know, the ego has no interest in individuating. It has no interest in becoming, in sort of breaking sort of its own linearity, because that is painful for the ego. That threatens its stability. And in the end, as we know, the stability of the ego is its sole purpose, and that's why it's its sole interest. It's the only interest of the ego is really to maintain this linearity towards the future, right? And of course, that's a paradox, right? Because you have this, as Jung says, Jung writes, when a situation occurs which corresponds to a given archetype, the archetypes becomes activated and compulsiveness appears, which, like an instinctual drive, gains its way against all reason and will, or else produces a conflict of pathological dimension, that is to say, neurosis. So let's ignore the neurosis part and just say it gains its way against all reason and will, of course, being categories of the ego, right? The central interpretive dominant of the consciousness. But the archetype, so the core, becomes activated anyways thereby, because it has no content, activating the flesh around it. So there's this sort of a situation, when you know very well you're in a happy marriage and everything is great, but then you encounter an anima figure and you're alert, or it's this typical situation, mythological situation of the nymph in the swamp, right? And she'll draw you into the water and you'll drown anyways, and you'll die, right? I mean, mythologically you'll die, but in reality you will commit an irresponsible act that will lead to the death of certain aspects of your ego, the interpretive scheme, right, that you've built. And that is your own image as a continually faithful and so on person. And this may call into action everything you've always thought about, thought you are, right? A loving person, someone that's loyal, and so on and so forth. And why did that happen? Well, because there was an encounter with an archetypal force that drove forward and activated on its way towards the ego, activated certain personal traumas, personal unintegrated aspects of, let's say, the shadow, right, which is sort of the suppressed, that which you have to integrate in the second part of the individuation. And in that process, it drove you to perform an action that you didn't want to perform. So Jung says here, and I think I talked about this in other videos before, but Jung says, the one thing about the complex that is not accepted beyond his own psychology is that complexes can have you, right? You don't have complexes, but complexes have you. And this is by way of their activation within an archetypal situation in a very strong sense. In a weaker sense, it doesn't always take this constellation, right? It takes the stronger the constellation, let's say the more archetypal the encounter, which always has to do with your own flesh you build around the archetype, right? But it has to do also with the closeness, let's say, to the archetype and so on. So how close is this to a collective, let's say, a human transcendent situation, a situation that transcends your own particular situations you encountered in life? The stronger the impact on the ego will be, the stronger the rupture, as I call it, will be. And so this is precisely where we kick in and say the rupture of the ego serves as a call to adventure. So whenever the ego is ruptured, it is called to venture into what is sort of a movement into the underworld, a downward movement into, let's say, this fearful world that is unknown to the ego. And so alchemy, and here we move to alchemy. Alchemy essentially discusses the entire process from the preparation of the ego towards this movement into and towards sort of the final solution of this movement in the conjunctio. And so essentially, the way I view it is, or I think there are two. Essentially, there are two separate circles here, right? This is a circle, as I show as well. Circle after rupture. I hope I'll show it somewhere. One circle is the circle you perform in the aftermath of a rupture. So this is a forced descent. It is essentially what follows the active inflation. So the conflict, right? So you have the sort of the moment of inflation, where the ego essentially moves towards hubris. You know, you fly towards the sun. You know you shouldn't do it, but you still do it. You fly towards the sun, and there's a moment of hubris, and your wings burn, and you fall. Right. So it's this moment of fall. Right. This moment of fall that is precisely the rupture, the moment of rupture of what you thought you had the power to do. Right. This is basically what the ego is prompted to do in it, sort of what I call a negative judgment. So the moment in which something that you haven't, let's say, something that you thought have power over reveals itself to be autonomous, if you will. So you thought you had reconciled with your past sins, let's say, or whatever, or maybe you forgot them. But then because by way of their connection to sort of archetypal situations, let's say let's say you've experienced the death of someone you loved, and you thought, oh, I have reconciled, I'm done with that, I've gotten over that, and then you encounter a situation where sort of the archetype of that, sort of the archetype of that situation, because we all experience death, and humans always have experienced that, gets activated, and that draws energy towards that personal sort of complex element of the complex, and that sort of springs into consciousness and just destroys you in a way, right? Or Jung has the story in his Mysterium Conjunctionis where it's the king who's essentially he drinks a lot of water before going into battle, so he's bloodthirsty, right? And he thereby drowns himself. Essentially, he dies, and sort of that in that way he gets overwhelmed, and as we'll see in this moment of solutio, where he has to then attain the sacrificial attitude and sort of go into a sauna, sweat the water out, get dried out, and so on, in order to then be die and be reborn. But let's move on and let's say, so alchemy is a sense. So this is the sort of the rupture that occurs involuntarily, right? This archetype springing forth, and then what alchemy represents is, I think, to some extent, it's also a description of this, what you do after the rupture. But to some extent, it's also a description of voluntarily descending into the underworld. And I think this is also a big part of what Peterson promotes in his work. It's like you have to voluntarily expose yourself to situations that will create a moment of rupture. And it's part of what Jung also proposes in his second stage of individuation, or where he essentially where he essentially proposes that you have to move towards this underworld voluntarily. Okay. So before we delve into the archetypal images, let me just read you a quote from Jung on alchemy in general. So Jung writes, the alchemical operations were real, and this is an interview with Mircea Eliade. The alchemical operations were real, only this reality was not physical but psychological. Alchemy represents the projection of a drama, both cosmic and spiritual, in laboratory terms. The opus magnum had two aims, the rescue of the human soul and the salvation of the cosmos. What the alchemists called matter was in reality the unconscious self. So they wanted to rescue spiritus mercurialis, right? The Mercury spirit out of matter, which is essentially the rescue of the self, right? It's the reconnection. It's the second phase of the individuation, which is the reconnection with the self. The self being essentially the microcosm of the collective unconscious, right? So you have essentially macrocosm, microcosm logic, where you have the entirety of the collective unconscious, the cosmos, macrocosm, and within, situated or localized within your own expression of it, which is the self, which is then those bones that are at the center of the complexes in the way they express in their different weights, let's say, for you, right? They're all there, but for you, they have different weights, okay? So what the alchemists called matter was in reality the unconscious self, so that's what they wanted to rescue. The soul of the world, the anima mundi, which was identified with the spiritus mercurialis, was imprisoned in matter. This is also very Gnostic, right? The Gnostic idea that you have the imprisonment of, you have Yaldabaoth, for example. Like, I think I'm not so familiar. Well, I am familiar with the Gnostic canons, but I haven't read it in a while. So you have basically the soul as one, as a whole, fragmented and then trapped in the matter, in the body, right, of different humans, and so you have to salvate that or rescue it. It is for this reason that the alchemists believed in the truth of matter, because matter was actually their own psychic life. But it was a question of freeing this matter or saving it, in a word, of finding the philosopher's stone. And so Jung then writes in his work on psychology of alchemy, he writes, now all these myth pictures, so the alchemical myth pictures, represent a drama of the human psyche on the further side of consciousness, showing man as both the one to be redeemed and the redeemer, right? This is the idea also of Christ, right? Christ is the one to be redeemed. He redeems him as the collective, as the body of Christ, right? The collective human body or vessel. But at the same time, he's the redeemer. The first formulation is Christian, the second alchemical. Okay, in the first case, man attributes the need of redemption to himself and leaves the work of redemption, the opus, to the autonomous divine figure. In the latter case, man takes upon himself the duty of carrying out the redemption, redeeming opus, and attributes the state of suffering and the consequent need of redemption to the anima mundi, imprisoned in matter. In both cases, redemption is at work, right? So you have this quite clear here. And I think what is also quite apparent is that and Jung says this in his Psychology and Alchemy pretty clearly. He says that the goal of the work was never carried out because it cannot be carried out. And this will lead us sort of to the final conclusion of this video. Not right now, don't worry. But you can listen to me talking for a couple more decades. But finally, it'll lead us to the conclusion that it must not be attainable. The goal of the alchemical opus must not be attainable, for if it was attainable, we'd be back in a sort of eternal hubris situation again, right? And so you have this idea of the vessel, right? So this is the general, sort of, we're still in the general introduction of alchemy, right? Where does the alchemical process of transmutation take place? It takes essentially place within the vessel, within this retort, which is a very peculiar. It's sort of a dual aspect image, right? Where you have, Jung says here in Psychology and Alchemy, although an instrument, it nevertheless has peculiar connections with the prima materia as well as the lapis. So the prima materia is the material, that which you perform transformation on. So it's the material that you use to transform that into the lapis being sort of the goal, right? The individual, the stone, that which can never be achieved, right? But you have this idea that the retort itself is the prima materia as well as the lapis, which in itself is weird, right? That's a paradox, right? How can something be the first and the last material? And you have this across all alchemical readings, this bizarre paradox that you have the lapis, which is actually that which you need to transform. And again, this is the redeemed sort of issue, right? You have yourself, you have to be transformed, but in order to be transformed, you need this, first of all, the retort as this sort of this vessel that contains everything, right? the psyche as a whole, right? But then at the same time also matter as a whole, which you have to sort of prune. So you have to find yourself in order then to transform yourself. So it's this whole, in very peculiar language, it's essentially saying that what we're doing here is within us. And that doesn't mean it's only within us, as we'll see also in the synchronistic issues in later videos. You have this situation where within and without are sort of unified on a certain level that is to be rediscovered, right? I talked about it earlier, where you have this moment of unity in early stages of life, or early stages of psychological or conscious differentiation in sort of the human history, right? So the vessel, so here he continues here, the vessel is a kind of matrix or uterus from which the Philos Philosophorum, the Filius Philosophorum, so the philosophical child, the miraculous stone, is to be born. Hence, it is required that the vessel, you know, be not only round but egg-shaped, and so on and so forth. Like, so there's this whole there's this infinity of mythological images that play into this, right? Where you have the images of birth and death, and burial rituals where people are buried in a sort of uterus of an animal, in, let's say, what Jung or Lagan would call primitive societies, or primitive burial myths. You have these ideas, initiation rituals, that you're reborn. So it plays into this continuous cycle of death and rebirth. It plays into this circular reality of time. And so let's now get into what this precisely means and how it plays out in alchemy, right? First of all, so the first image you'll see here, and I hope I'll be able to put this somewhere up here, is sort of the end and the beginning. It's this mandala fountain. And this is from the Rosarium Philosophorum, so the Rosarium images. You can find them in Jung, you can find them in Edinger, you can find them if you Google them. Find them hidden deeply in your collective unconscious. Just kidding. But so what those are essentially symbolic expressions of what we've been discussing the whole time. So of the cycle of descent and ascent. What I would call the transcendental movement, so the movement up and down the ladder of the world tree. But we'll get to that probably at the end of the cycle. So the first image is the end and the beginning at the same time. All symbolism is contained. You have this fountain of youth, if you will, if you want to call that, this eternal life fountain, right? Which is the philosopher's stone in itself. That is basically sort of, you know, it's all images are contained. The opposites, you have the sun, Luna, Sol, and the moon. The sun, Sol, and Luna, the moon. And you have the water in the middle. And so you have this mystical source that now you attempt to reconcile, right? But the problem is that you can't reconcile something that's one, right? You can't bring something together if there's already sort of one in this weird way, right? And that's why you need a separatio, so a separation as the first step, right? You need to separate the opposites in order then to combine them in a different manner. And so the separation, the emergence of the opposites, right, as the soul that sits between them, the Holy Spirit in the form of the dove here, occurs before the sacrifice of essentially the first attitude of sacrifice. So the first moment in which you have to strip, or Edinger calls it the stripping for action. You have to strip down your clothes. You have to get naked in order for a process to begin. And this is the first moment of sacrifice. The first moment of it's usually in this sort of external rupture that occurs. It's a forceful moment of sacrifice because it's calcinatio, so that's sort of the burning, the fire, the calcination. It's related to the fire imagery. You'll see also in dreams. You'll see a roasting of the king. You have in the Mysterium Conjunctionis story that I mentioned. You have the drying of the king in the sauna, and so on, which is sort of, it is a process of purification that occurs, let's say, from an external force. So something comes in and basically you can imagine it as like a force comes in and boom, kicks something away, kind of thing. That's how you could imagine it. In a voluntary sense, it would be the descent into something, into fire, the descent into hell. That is followed by a further step of cleansing. So a further fall, a further sinking into the unconscious, this water image, this idea of solutio, which is basically sort of the idea of descending into the underworld. You know, it's this idea of the king that drowns. It's the idea of being engulfed by the uterus again. It's and what you can see here in this, within the solutio, you have this merging. You witness, you recognize this merging, this union of the opposites, the manifestation of the mystery, which is sort of the unification of the anima and animus, so conscious and unconscious, if you will, within the river, within the water. It's the moment of baptism, if you will, and what happens in baptism, you unify the individual body with the body of Christ, right? Which is followed by death or mortificatio, because suddenly there is something is drawn away, like if the individual dies, right, or if you sacrifice something in which energy was bound up, the energy retracts or retreats into the psyche, and it cannot no longer be exercised outside. So there's a moment of emptiness, a moment of death, a laying down on the tomb, which you see represented here in a hermaphroditic action. So you have both that have you have the opposites that have mingled, and they're now hermaphrodite, and they're laying down, but they're not one, right? They're not yet one, but they move towards the hermaphroditic. Hermaphrodite still with the two heads, and still not being able to stand up, right? And so you have then in the next images, you have this, and Jung, by the way, talks about mortificatio, and of course that has to do with the integration of the shadow. Jung writes here, the process of individuation or alchemical work is difficult and strewn with obstacles. The alchemical opus is dangerous. Right at the beginning, you meet the dragon, the chthonic spirit, the devil, or as the alchemicals called it, the blackness, the nigredo, and this encounter produces suffering. Matter suffers right up to the final disappearance of the blackness. In psychological terms, the soul finds itself in the throes of melancholy, locked in a struggle with the shadow. The mystery of the conjunctio, the central mystery of alchemy, aims precisely at the synthesis of the opposites, the assimilation of the blackness, the integration of the devil for the awakened Christian, and so on and so forth. Let's leave that out. And it can never be completely fulfilled, right? You have this throughout the entirety of the process. You have this melancholic, this deeply introverted attitude, if you will, this deeply problematic moment that you're dead the entirety of the time. And this is not something that happens in like a casual nighttime routine. It's like, oh yeah, let me go down and descend into underworld and then be reborn and so on. No, this is something that goes on over the course of months, weeks, months, or years, and again is constantly repeated. And death always accompanies any of these inflictions upon the ego, right, from the beginning on. And so what happens in this moment of mortificatio, again, to produce this melancholy, you have energy leaving the body, and this is basically the separation of soul and body. It's the if you will, the spirit, the spirit Mercury leaves the body, exits the body, which leaves the body essentially with this retreat, right? It's the moment of sublimatio, so the moment of something leaving the body, something moving out of the body, which is sort of which is a moment in which the spiritual center of the body leaves. Water ascends in distillation and is separated from the body. So in the process of sublimation in dry substances such as minerals, the spiritual is raised from the corporeal, subtilized, and the pure separated from the impure, right? The purification in this sense is positive it's the ego separating from the self. But of course, what happens in this moment, or what is at stake in this moment, is hubris, right? Again, so you see that you have, even in this moment of death, right, that accompanies all these scenes, you have hubris as a compensatory mechanism, as a threat at stake, right? And this is actually interesting, because here you have this moment again of inflation, which is then followed by a divine intervention again. So you could even say you have this call, this call to adventure, right? Where you have, in this case, but it's a call to adventure by a sign of God, as you can see in the story of Gideon in the Bible, where the sort of the dew drips down on the fur in Gideon, and in this case, it's sort of it could be another dream, right? It could be something that you experience or witness in nature. Whatever it is, it's a call to return to the quest, a call to return to that which you were meant to be fulfilling, that drips down from above. So it's a cultural moment, or and here you could say it's a moment of coagulatio, and coagulatio, of course, being connected to the earth. So it's this grounding of the spiritual, it's the grounding of the sublimated element into the earth. It's the process of rooting, right? Right. So it's this moment. So it's that which flights, which is grounded again, and this is followed by integration, by the return of the spiritus mercurialis into the body from the heavens, which is accompanied, of course, by sort of the image of the bird in this case, the image of the bird being born from the depth, right, and from the other bird sort of raising it, you know, and then leads to the conjunctio, so the opposite of the unity of the opposites, which folds into the beginning again. And so this is also a very important it's a very important realization that you have in the conjunctio, in this combined, so the hermaphrodite rising, if you will. You have this moment of rebirth, but it's in the same time, it's this moment of it's the moment of utmost danger, if you will, because it's the moment of in which everything has to begin again, and therefore the moment of possible hubris. You know, we have this energy that you have essentially the body enchanted with, this, and that follows this moment of humility, but then you have sort of this moment again of possible inflation, and the cycle starts again. So it's really important for us to recognize that this is a cyclical movement in which slowly the bone, if you will, is stripped of the flesh. Not relating necessarily to the complex metaphor where you have the bone as the alchemical core, and the archetypal core, and the flesh as the personal experiences. But it's this moment in which you strip whatever the ego narrates and interprets. You strip that essentially towards its bone, you know, so towards the actual fundament of that process, okay, or of their core. Okay, and so in the hero's journey, of course, just to reiterate that, you have the call to adventure, again, as we discussed, you have the meeting of the mentor, possibly or not, and you have the descent into the underworld, which has a couple of thresholds that you have to cross, so there are challenges, and again, those require sacrifices and operations on the body, on that which you're operating on. You may get rejected, and you have sort of the approach of the innermost cave, or that which sort of the place where the darkness is darkest for you. So this idea of inster quilis invenitur that Jung puts forth. So truth is to be found in the place that's darkest for you. And this was, by the way, also the motto of the archetype, the alchemies themselves, right? Where it's like, you know, the obscure through the more obscure. Like, how did they want to find truth, right? The method was like obscure through more obscure, insane, the insane through the more insane, or something like that. There's a Latin phrase that I forgot or can't recall in this very moment. And so this is where you have this constant cyclical movement around this core, around this moment of hubris and the sacrificial attitude, and sort of this descent and ascent, descent, ascent. And so that's why I call it sort of the transcendental vortex that moves towards the self. Although the integration of the self, I think, is the wrong way to frame it, because you can't integrate this. Like, that's not the point. The self is the puncturing element that drives you to move towards it, in quotation marks, which is simply moving against the ego's interpretation and towards sort of an integrative attitude of the other. And what's important, we can talk about this transcendental movement in more detail in other videos, but now comes the important point where I want to interlude sort of the issue of God, right? We know the alchemical opus has never been achieved. The lapis has never been integrated. And that's why you need a North Star, let's say, a self, a projection vessel of the self that is impossible to achieve, right? Because otherwise you may fall prey to the illusion that you can actually achieve whatever you want to achieve, right? And you may fall prey to the illusion that now have successfully individuated, which is this illusion that a lot of modern or contemporary Jungians, especially people, this sort of New Agey kind of Jung in the New Age context, if you will, social media users, you have this illusion that essentially you can get wherever your idols want to be. And so this is the problem of celebrity cultures, where celebrities are essentially raised to the throne of God, or not necessarily celebrities, but wealth, let's say capitalist endeavors that are sort of raised to this point of God. And so the idea is that you have to keep God at a distance, right? You have to keep him as far away from you as possible, while at the same time attempting to make a connection to him, in as far as God is then a metaphor for the self, right? And this is also the paradox of the self and the ego axis, because you want to build an axis. You don't want to have the ego descend back into the self. That would be the death of the ego, right? It would be it would be essentially, I think it would be a form of psychosis, right? Where you have the ego essentially dissolve within the self, and therefore, again, thinking, sort of having this insane moment like you have in Dürrenmatt's The Physicians, right, where you think you are something that you're not, and so on and so forth. And so, which is also probably a possibility in this sort of idol culture, where you but that's for another time, that's for another discussion. It's just that I wanted to also point out the fact that Jung pointed out that you have the rituals in Christianity, especially in Catholicism. You have the rituals that are performed in order to keep God at distance. Like, you wouldn't want Christ to return, for example. Like you have in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, in the story of the Inquisitor. You have this active decision of the Inquisitor against the return of Jesus. Jesus is right there. You could have him salvate humans, but you don't want to be salvated as human. Like, why would you want to be? If you're salvated, if that's essentially, probably, it's akin to the return to the womb, right? To the return to the uterus, where it's like, that would be the death of you, right? You would be dissolved into the collective. And that's not the point. The point is that you have an active relationship, a mediation. You live the mediating function of the ego, which is sort of the ego in this liminal moment between the two worlds, the underworld and the heavens, right? This movement up and down the ladder, this transcendental movement that's continually performed by the ego. That's what you're aiming for, not the fundamental, the dissolvement, the dissolution of the ego within the collective. Well, with that, thank you very much for joining again. Consider to subscribe, and also to recommend this video to those who could benefit from it. And please do comment, if you have any questions, if you want me to record anything else, and if you have any points where you disagree or you agree, and I'm happy to interact. Thank you.